It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, talking about an important topic for Black History Month. And one of the great reform movements in the 19th century was the abolitionist movement. And we're going to find out this evening that it was quite varied, both in terms of persons, organizations, strategies, and tactics. As you can see, the photograph of the Virginia Public Library in 1906. I was happy to find that as a cover page. The title is Paths to Abolition, the Leaders and Organizations that Led to a New Birth of Freedom. Here we go. Oh, this way. There are two things that I hope to accomplish this evening. One is to give you a brief historic overview of abolitionism with its major actors, its struggles and accomplishments. And number two, I think you'll find embedded in this conversation some strategies and tactics, methodologies, models that really could be utilized today for social issues that we face in our own time. Of course, we're talking about the problem of slavery. And as you know, for reading the Constitution, there was a 3/5 compromise made with those states in the South, so that 3/5 of those who were slaves would be counted for purposes of representation. After 1808, the international slave trade would have stopped. At that point, the domestic slave trade began. And as a result, between 1800 and 1860, over 800,000 slaves were traded from the colonies on the East Coast to those in the Deep South. New Orleans became a chief hub for cotton trade, as well as for the selling trade of slaves. By 1860, so 80% of the cotton that Great Britain was purchasing was purchased from the South. So these are some very big numbers. Just one other little comment. We think of slavery in the South as being a large-scale operation. It certainly was. But you might want to know that less than 1% of slaveholders in the South had more than 100 slaves. And 76% of those white folks did not have slaves at all. Okay. There we go. There. This chart kind of shows up a comparison between slavery and the production of cotton. And notice in 1790 there was not much cotton, that's in green. But notice as you get closer to 1860, that the growth of the cotton industry, as well as the numbers of slaves, were very large. So they were interconnected. Here's a map that shows you slavery in the colonies. Notice that all the colonies had slaves. And notice that Virginia had the most slaves. And we can go to the next slide. And this slide shows you in 1860 the numbers of slaves. Notice that Virginia still has the larger number of slaves, but it's joined by South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi for having no excess of 400,000 slaves each. New Orleans here's a painting of New Orleans. The port of New Orleans became very, very big and important during slavery times. The range of abolitionism. We think of abolitionism, we think of maybe Garrison and Frederick Douglass, but there were many different types of groups and individuals and organizations that were trying to achieve abolitionism. that included the revolutionaries like John Brown, Nat Turner, organizers and prophets like David Walker, social movements started by William Lloyd Garrison, later Frederick Douglass, the Underground Railroad, which would include, of course, Harriet Tubman. There were many spokespersons such as Sojourner Truth, the Grimke sisters, Theodore Dwight Weld, also Thoreau and Emerson were very much in the anti-slavery movement. Also were funders, political leaders, presidential leaders, especially Abraham Lincoln and U.S. Grant. And then persons who were basically calling for the end of slavery that may be in a gradual way, not immediate. And that was the case of the Tappan brothers. This is a kind of a photo montage of some of the leaders in the abolitionist movement. You probably recognize most of them. John Brown, Douglass. This is actually someone's imagination of Turner. Harriet Tubman, Garrison, Harriet Jacobs, Lincoln and Grant, and Sojourner Truth. The other way. Okay. Here's another kind of list of those abolitionist models. There were anti-slavery societies, organizers, resistance movements, revolutions, churches, community organizations, writers, fugitive slaves, slave narratives, those who wrote about it, those engaged in civil disobedience, congressional leaders, John Quincy Adams, presidents, especially Lincoln and Grant, radical Republicans working inside of government, and also many writers as well, including the Grimke sisters, Emerson, Thoreau, and also Catherine Beecher Stowe. One of the first organizations was the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Organization, and that involved Ben Franklin. Here's a quote from Franklin: "Slavery is such an atrocious debasement of human nature that its very extirpation, if not performed with solicitous care, we sometimes open a source of serious evils." Here's the founding of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, and also Ben Franklin came aboard at the end of his life. And this is a quote from Ben Franklin. Just before he died, Franklin was very much interested and concerned about freeing slaves. And just before he died, he had a proposal for Congress to consider abolishing slavery. And this is the quote from one of his last pieces of writing. "To countenance the restoration of liberty to those unhappy men who alone in this land of freedom are degraded into perpetual bondage, and who amidst the general joy of surrounding freemen are groaning in servile subjection, that you would devise means for removing this inconsistency from the character of the American people." This is about the American Colonization Society. In addition to those who wanted to immediately abolish slavery, there was a very strong organization and movement that was for colonization, that is removing slaves or former slaves to places like Liberia or somewhere in the Caribbean. The Colonization Society was founded in 1816. James Monroe, president, was one of the first presidents of the society. Their goal was to send slaves and ex-slaves out of the country. The city of Monrovia in Liberia was named after James Monroe. I'd like to talk about Richard Allen. Now, Richard Allen is the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was a slave who became free and then established the first AME church. And he was born into slavery in 1760, and he purchased slavery in Delaware. And in 1787, he established the Free African Society, and in 1816, the first AME church. Here's a chronology of anti-slavery during the age of Jackson, because ironically, it's during the age of Andrew Jackson that the anti-slavery movement began to really take hold. There was a number of slave rebellions or attempted rebellions, notably Denmark Vesey in 1822. David Walker published a pamphlet called Walker's Appeals in 1829. Then you had Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. In 1831, that's when William Lord Garrison begins his paper, The Liberator, which becomes the chief organ for anti-slavery. David Walker in 1829, he was a freeman, and he ended up in Massachusetts. He was a writer for Richard Allen, who started an anti-slavery journal. And his appeals probably reflect the greatest analysis, the deepest analysis of the deep character of slavery in the New World. This quote that I'm going to read you expresses something that's very profound. He said, "We, the colored people of the United States of America, are the most wretched, degraded, and abject set of beings that ever lived since the world began. And that the white Americans, having reduced us to the wretched condition of slavery, treat us in that condition more cruel than any heathen nation did of any people whom it reduced to slavery in the past." Now we come to Garrison. Garrison, of course, is the main driver for abolition at this time. In 1831, he becomes a national figure. There's some details about Garrison. He was a seaman who became a writer. At 13 years of age, he was an apprentice with the Newburyport Herald. And later, he was the editor for the National Philanthropist and the Journal of the Times. And by 1831, he begins his own journal called The Liberator. Now, Garrison's model of abolitionism, I think, is very important because it's a little bit different than what you find with other models. But notice the characteristics of Garrison's model for abolitionism. He called for immediate, not gradual abolition. He believed in human equality. He was a journalist, writer, and public speaker, so he used those skills. But he rejected political activity. He thought that all politics were corrupt, and he thought the U.S. Constitution was a slave document, so he rejected that. He was a pacifist, argued for non-resistance, non-conformist, that he was not for revolutionary activity. He believed that the Constitution was not something to depend upon because it seemed to him to sanction slavery. Politically, he seemed to be closer to anarchism than he did to a formal political stance. And he was secular in his views. And finally, he was a disunionist. So ironically, Garrison was for the free states to secede from those states that were enslaved. There were also many women who were involved in the anti-slavery movement. There was the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, started by Lucretia Mott, and here's Angelina Grimke. Lucretia Mott was also at Seneca Falls in 1846 with the Women's Rights Group, sponsored by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others. Then a radically different model, of course, from Garrison is John Brown. And John Brown was very interested, of course, in ending slavery immediately, but he chose a much more violent path. and about 22 of his party were involved. Some escaped, but more than 10 of them were killed, and 7 were tried and hung. And here's something I want to read to you from John Brown. There's a lot of discussion about how crazy or how much of a religious fanatic was John Brown. And I'll let you decide. But I do want to share some quotes with you. I'm going to read that which is in the yellow. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, on behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights have been disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done. Now, a champion of John Brown was Henry David Thoreau. And in late 1859, he wrote a tract called A Plea for Captain John Brown. And I'm just going to read you a little bit of this because he really supports what John Brown tried to do. Call him misguided, garrulous, insane, vindictive. So you write in your easy chairs, and thus he, wounded, responds from the floor of the armory, clear as a cloudless sky, true as the voice of nature is. I see now that it was necessary that the bravest and most human man in all the country should be hung. Now we go to slave narratives. In addition to these organizations, of course, there were many people who were ex-slaves who began writing their own stories about their experience. And we know now that there were at least 6,000 such narratives. 150 of them were published, and there may be 2,300 some odd oral histories that were compiled well after the Civil War. These are some of the more famous writers who happened to write as former slaves. You would recognize him as Harriet Tubman. This is Solomon Northrop in the middle, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth sitting with Abraham Lincoln. Sojourner Truth is one of my favorites. I hope that one day you might read her confessions. She was tall, impressive, a great orator. She was enslaved to Dutch farmers in New York, not the South. She was illiterate, could not read or write. She was supposed to have been set free before 1827, but was not, so she walked away. Was sheltered by the Quakers, joined a religious group called the Kingdom of Matthias. And there she became an itinerant preacher, evangelist, and spokesperson for human rights, as well as for women's rights and slave rights. Her treatise, A Narrative of Sojourner Truth, was published in 1850. You might be interested in the maps of how those engaged in the Underground Railroad found their way to freedom. Notice on the left, you can see Harriet Tubman's road from Bucktown near Maryland all the way to Rochester, St. Catharines. To the top right, you can see another map, and notice how rich are the trails in Ohio. And then the bottom right, you see the trail of Frederick Douglass from Maryland to New York, ultimately to Massachusetts. This is a close-up map of the slave routes out of the south to the north. But notice again, Ohio and Cincinnati as being a hub, as well as Philadelphia. And Cincinnati becomes very important for us, as we'll see in just a moment. Because there was the Beecher family, Lyman Beecher. And Lyman Beecher has an incredible group of family members. Among them was Harriet Beecher Stowe. And you know Harriet because she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is another close-up map of Ohio. You can see that Cincinnati is a hub, and that's where Harriet was for 16 years. This is the Beecher family, perhaps the most famous progressive family of the 19th century on every major cause, from the women's rights to abolition. And a few things about Harriet Beecher Stowe. I'd love to talk about this later if we have time. I'm just going to read a little bit at the top. This is a fictional work, but it's based upon her interviews with fugitive slaves, abolitionists, and slaveholders. She wrote 40 installments of this book before it was released in 1852. It sold 300,000 copies in the US, 1.5 million the first year in Great Britain. She lived in Cincinnati for 16 years, where she learned about the stories that she would incorporate into her book. Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is perhaps the most photographed individual in the 19th century. He is certainly an icon for the abolitionist movement and for civil rights and human rights. From Douglass, the thing worse than rebellion is a thing that causes rebellion. Who was Frederick Douglass? Slave, escaped slave, shipbuilder, orator, prophet, preacher, newspaper editor, organizer, advocate, resistor, patriot, and citizen. That's okay. He was an escaped slave, self-taught. He began as a spokesperson for Garrison, but later moved away from Garrison because Garrison's pacifist tendencies did not suit Mr. Douglass. He agreed with what John Brown was doing, and ultimately would have 3 of his sons involved in the Civil War. He excoriated white slave owners, a view of the church and religion, and he represented a much more prophetic view of Christianity, as discussed by David Blight in his new book on Frederick Douglass. He and Abe Lincoln have a lot in common, but they also diverge. They both disagreed with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They both disagreed with Dred Scott, the fugitive slave law. They both believed that the Declaration and the Constitution were documents of freedom, not oppression. Douglass championed women's rights, but Douglass was also very critical of Abraham Lincoln early on before the Emancipation Proclamation. This is maybe the heart of what I'm trying to share with you this evening. These were Frederick Douglass's tactics that are universal tactics that could be used, I think, in any social justice movement's concerns. He had a dissenting pulpit, church resolutions, prophetic denunciations of slavery, both personal testimony and his writings. Denomination-wide declarations were encouraged. He used the press. He solicited pressure from other nations on the US. He started a social movement. It was a part of that. Campaigns, including in England, send the money back campaign. Those that were taking money from slaveholders, send it back. Direct action to free a person in jail. Resistance, albeit nonviolent resistance. He supported, however, armed resistance in the Civil War, and he became involved in political work as an ambassador. And now we get to the American Civil War. And you can see these incredible photographs of Mr. Lincoln and Mr. Grant. Now, the causes of the Civil War. You know what these causes are, but I must share with you tonight that I am for number 7, that all of these combinations must be seen in tandem, that the economic issues and the political issues were intertwined. However, it's pretty clear when you study the Confederate Convention's Constitution and the speeches of those who were the leaders, that slavery was very important to their process, both politically, economically, and socially. This is from a famous speech by the vice president of the CSA, Alexander Stephens, the so-called cornerstone speech. Notice what he says. Our new government is founded upon exactly this idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. It's the cornerstone of the Confederacy, he wrote. Also, this is a quote from a letter to Andrew Johnson from Sterling Cockrell in September of '65, just after the Civil War was over. We have much to say in vindication of our conduct, but this we must leave to history. The bloody conflict between brothers is closed, and we come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. Speaking of Lincoln, I suppose. The South had $2 billion invested in slaves. It was very natural that they should desire to protect and not lose this amount of property. Their action in this effect resulted in war. There was no desire to dissolve the Union, but to protect its property. The issue was made, and it is decided. So we can see from these two quotes how interconnected politics, government, and slavery was. Now we come to Abraham Lincoln. He's known, of course, in these parts for the famous speeches between he and Stephen Douglas. This is Mr. Douglas. Mr. Douglas, you may remember, championed popular sovereignty, which would allow each state or territory to decide for itself whether or not it should be a slave territory. And then the debate with Mr. Lincoln, this is what Mr. Douglas had to say to Lincoln. You say the country cannot exist half slave and half free. Well, it seems to me that the founding fathers designed it that way, that the country has not only survived this condition, but has grown. When you say that we have to be all slave or all free, why, them's fighting words. I hold that a Negro is not and never ought to be a citizen of the United States. I hold that this government was made on the white basis by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever, and should be administered by white men and none others. That's Mr. Douglas. In another speech, Mr. Lincoln sort of shared what he believed. And in some ways, it wasn't much different early on to that of Stephen Douglas, except that he was anti-slavery. Mr. Lincoln wanted to limit slavery within those geographical confines where it was currently found. But let us not be naive about Mr. Lincoln's position, and also more hopeful for his growth, which of course he engaged. Mr. Lincoln said, I am not, nor ever have I been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of white and black races. I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And as much as any other, I am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Now, Lincoln on slavery. This is a bit of a summary of Mr. Lincoln's point of view. He hates slavery. He wants to contain it, but he's not necessarily for equality. He favors colonization. And up until the Emancipation Proclamation of early 1863, he seems to be leaning this way pretty strongly. That's very disappointing for Frederick Douglass. He does not believe that the Constitution gave him the right, however, to end slavery on his own, because he thinks that slavery in some way sanctioned the Confederate position. However, in the Emancipation Proclamation, we can see a definite departure from his previous views, because there he argues that all slaves that exist in states that we're fighting, not the border states, they are free. And he argues that this is a military necessity, and it's a morally right thing to do, and is constitutionally justified. So he kind of changes his position, but it's based upon the notion of military necessity. He's also very pragmatic. He's appealing to the border states to consider accepting a gradual compensatory approach to emancipation that in one document would last all the way to 1900. So it's immediate emancipation for the South, but for the border states, maybe a more gradual approach. So he's conflicted, but he's also moving in the right direction. Finally, towards the end of his career, he passes the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. Just to kind of help us remember Lincoln's pragmatic position with respect to slavery prior to the Emancipation Proclamation is this very important quote. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I have here stated my purpose according to my view and my official duty. I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free and should be free. But he clearly is for the Union over everything else. In Lincoln's last major addresses, you may want to remember what he said. In the Emancipation Proclamation, all slaves were free in those states that were occupied by the Confederate government. So it's a challenge, it's a proclamation, more so than an actual enactment. But it's for military necessity, which gives the right of Union troops to set those folks free, not send them back. It also is a welcome statement for those that are trying to leave the South to be free. In the Gettysburg Address, perhaps the most important address or speech in American history, there are two phrases in there that I think capture the spirit of the Gettysburg Address. First of all, the phrase, he holds the proposition that all men are created equal. That's an expansive category, not the way the Confederates would understand it. Secondly, he is looking for the new birth of freedom. And that defines Lincoln's character and goal perhaps more than anything else. There's a great bit of discussion about Lincoln's religious views. I think he's somewhat deist, but he believed in providence. He believed that providence was on the side of freedom. He believed that the Creator was at work to end slavery, and the evil of slavery would be destroyed, in his view, through the medium of the Great Civil War. And he thought that that may be the purpose of the Civil War. Now we get to the radical Reconstruction that's done by the radical Republicans after the death of Mr. Lincoln. And what they did is they divided up the South into 5 military districts where they tried to monitor and to advance Reconstruction. These are the military districts. And you can see Texas, and Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, all the way up to Virginia. And Virginia was the first state in the red in 1870, as was North Carolina in 1870, when they came back into the Union. You can see the other states, the dates are a little bit later. Texas in 1873, Louisiana in 1877. Wait, go back. I read that wrong. I'm going to correct myself. Okay, the black dates are the dates when they were readmitted to the Union, and the dates in red are the dates when radical Reconstruction was called into question. So I misread that. I apologize. Okay, the key points. There were several civil rights bills that were enacted by the radical Republicans up to Grant. And we'll talk about that in a moment. In 1866, there was a Civil Rights Act that extended citizenship to anyone born in the U.S., that gave African Americans full equality before the law, and authorized the president to enforce this act through force. I should say something else, that it's not just the great leaders who helped to bring about abolition, but there were many other organizations that were working together. Among them was the Freedmen's Bureau, which had a huge impact in training, educating, and helping folks to learn their civil responsibilities and skills. The other thing is that African Americans got together in the North and also in the South during Reconstruction. There were a number of what was known as colored conventions. They began to take their education and their newly formed political skills to find a way to advance their causes. And finally, there were state conventions during the Reconstruction era, and as a result, many Black folks found themselves to be leaders of these movements, and they also found themselves being candidates for office. I thought you might be interested in this platform that came out of the freedmen and also from poor Southern whites, what their agenda was. So it's not just coming from the top down, but also from the freedmen and from poor whites as well. And this is their agenda: voting rights, land reform, public education, labor organization and labor representation, political education, the abolishment of debt, safety from intimidation and violence, the repeal of the Black codes, government assistance for elderly, aged, handicapped, and infirm peoples, equal access to public accommodations, and infrastructure improvements, levees, railroads, canals, and so forth. Now we come to Grant, and we're coming now to close to the end of my presentation. This is a drawing from Harper's Magazine when Grant became president in late 1868. You see that Grant is on a horse, that he has a sword that is going through the opponent. On the flag, it says Union, equal rights. It says equal rights. We probably do not think of Grant maybe championing equal rights, but he did throughout his presidency. Now, if you notice on the rear end of the horse, it says KKK. That, of course, is the Ku Klux Klan. The Grant presidency, in short, these were his accomplishments. This is a very complicated story. We're going to go into this actually in a few months on the Grant presidency if we come back to look at this in the library again. He supported and helped pass the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. He thwarted and defeated the Ku Klux Klan in the Carolinas. He sought to maintain Reconstruction policies in the South, and he passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The Black vote in the 1868 election basically put, because of the Freedmen's Bureau, the colored conventions, they helped to put Grant in office. These are just kind of a summary of Grant's Reconstruction policies. He supported civil rights, not just for Africans, but for many others. He favored a limited number of troops in the South to maintain Reconstruction. There needed to be a lot more, he would say later. He defeated the KKK activities in Carolina in the early 1870s, and he passed the 15th Amendment, which basically gave voting rights to the freedmen. The 13th Amendment was passed by Lincoln. That said that slavery and involuntary servitude is done. The radical Republicans were the ones who passed the 14th Amendment, perhaps the most important of the three Reconstruction amendments. All persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the U.S. And of the state where they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or the immunities of citizens of the U.S., nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And finally, the 15th Amendment that Grant passed, the champion, the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any other state on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so Grant championed this 15th Amendment. The other thing that happened under Grant's regime is that many African Americans, or some, very few actually, were able to find their way to the political process to become political leaders. In 1867, there was a person, in 1867, there were some 535 African Americans lynched. So the Reconstruction period is a very bloody time in the South and elsewhere. In 1868, John Menard tried to, was elected to Congress. So let's talk about that. Finally, in 1870, after people started, the first African American senator, Hiram Rose Revels, was elected as senator from the state of Mississippi. Ironically, Revels took the seat, the former seat of Jefferson Davis. I thought you would be interested in this map or this chart. This shows you the numbers of state legislatures. This is the Grant presidency, by the way, from 1810 to 1876. You see 633 state legislators, but 2 senators and 15 U.S. congressmen were elected when Grant was president. Conclusions. Got a couple of slides here, we're done. Though slavery was ended, discrimination in many forms began. And the ugly side of Reconstruction is that this was a very violent period. Number 2, the gains of the abolitionist movement are permanently embedded in the constitutional amendments 13 through 15. 3, it took the work of many individuals, organizations, and significant world-changing events to end slavery in the US. 4, many tactics were used by these individuals that are still viable today, that we can consider when we're trying to advance another social cause. Finally, social change is a long, long process. And I want to end with 2 quotes, one from Frederick Douglass. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will. And finally, something to keep in mind as we look at the world situations today, domestically and in foreign policy. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And let us all pray that that is true. Thank you.